I'm sorry.
My name is Sarah Bennett, and the day I woke up in a hospital bed, I discovered that my younger sister had married the man who was supposed to become my husband. I wish I could tell you that was the worst part of my story, but it wasn't. The most painful truth wasn't that Jordan Walker was wearing a wedding ring with another woman. It was that the woman standing beside him, smiling as though she had won the greatest prize of her life, was my own sister, Charlie Bennett. The same sister I had loved, protected, defended, and trusted since we were children. I remember staring at them, convinced the medication was making me hallucinate. Nothing made sense. I had gone into surgery believing I was planning my wedding. I woke up to discover I had somehow become the outsider in my own love story. Everyone around me acted as though what had happened was unfortunate, but necessary. They expected me to accept it, heal, and move on. What none of them knew was that every smile, every tear, every excuse they offered only pushed me closer to uncovering a truth that would destroy everything my family had spent months trying to hide. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end of this story, because what really happened between Jordan and Charlie wasn't the story my family wanted anyone to believe. When people hear a story like mine, they usually ask the same question first. How could a sister do something so heartless? The answer isn't simple, because betrayal rarely begins with one decision. It begins with tiny moments that seem harmless until you look back and connect them. Looking back now, I can see those moments as clearly as if they happened yesterday. But at the time, I was too happy to notice them. Jordan Walker was the kind of man people admired the moment they met him. He was thoughtful without trying to impress anyone, successful without being arrogant, and the sort of person who remembered birthdays, called his parents every Sunday, and treated strangers with the same respect he showed people he loved. My friends constantly joked that I had found the last good man left in America. Even Charlie used to tease me, saying she wished she could find someone exactly like him. I always laughed because she sounded happy for me. I never imagined those words meant something entirely different. If I had known what was happening inside her mind, I would have protected my relationship far more carefully. But love has a way of making us believe the people closest to us would never intentionally hurt us. I believed my family was my safest place. I couldn't have been more wrong. Charlie Bennett had always been the favorite daughter. It wasn't something anyone openly admitted, but everyone could see it. If Charlie made a mistake, my parents called it a misunderstanding. If I made the same mistake, it became a lesson about responsibility. Charlie always received the newest gifts, the biggest celebrations, and endless praise for achievements that were often no greater than mine. I convinced myself none of it mattered, because she was my sister, and I truly loved her. I celebrated every success she had as though it were my own. When she lost a job, I helped pay her bills without expecting repayment. When her relationships ended, I stayed up late listening to her cry, reminding her that someone wonderful would eventually come into her life. Never once did I imagine she would look at my happiness and decide it belonged to her instead. Everything changed the night Jordan proposed. It was one of the happiest evenings of my life. As I looked around at our families celebrating together, I noticed Charlie watching us from across the room. Everyone else was smiling with excitement. Charlie smiled too, but for the briefest second, there was something in her expression that I couldn't explain. I dismissed it almost immediately. I told myself I was imagining things. Sometimes the greatest mistakes we make are the ones we dismiss because we don't want to believe someone we love could ever become the source of our deepest heartbreak. If someone had met Jordan Walker before all of this happened, they would probably tell you he was the kind of man every parent hoped their daughter would marry. He wasn't perfect because he had endless money or because he never made mistakes. He was perfect because of the way he treated people when no one was watching. He believed respect wasn't something you earned after success. It was something everyone deserved from the beginning. The first time we met was at a neighborhood charity event. I had volunteered to help organize supplies for families who had lost their homes after a severe storm, and Jordan was one of the volunteers, delivering food and clothing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. In fact, I barely noticed him until I saw him quietly giving his own lunch to an elderly man who had insisted he wasn't hungry, even though everyone could tell he hadn't eaten all day. There was something about that simple act of kindness that stayed with me. We talked for only a few minutes before going our separate ways, but somehow those few minutes felt more genuine than conversations I had shared with people I'd known for years. A week later, he asked if I'd like to have coffee with him, and I agreed, without realizing that one small decision would eventually change every part of my life. Falling in love with Jordan never felt rushed. It happened naturally, one ordinary day at a time. He remembered the little things that most people forgot. He knew I couldn't start my mornings without coffee, that I always cried during emotional movies, even when I pretended I wouldn't, and that I called my grandmother every Sunday because she always worried if I forgot. He listened more than he spoke, and when he promised something, he followed through. I never had to wonder where I stood with him because he made me feel chosen every single day. Even during difficult moments, he never raised his voice or made me feel as though my feelings didn't matter. My friends constantly told me how lucky I was, and I agreed with them. I believed I had finally found the kind of love people spend their whole lives searching for. Looking back now, those memories are still some of the happiest I've ever had. That's what makes what happened afterwards so difficult to accept. It's hard to reconcile the beautiful life we were building with the painful reality that eventually replaced it. Our families loved watching us together. My parents often said Jordan brought out the best in me, while his parents welcomed me into their home as though I had always belonged there. Holidays became larger because both families celebrated together. Birthdays turned into traditions, and Sunday dinners became something everyone looked forward to. It felt as though our lives had already merged long before we exchanged wedding vows. Even Charlie seemed excited in those early days. She would joke that Jordan had raised the standard for every man she would ever date. Sometimes she laughed and said, "Sarah, if you ever let him go, don't be surprised if I steal him." Everyone laughed, including me. It sounded like harmless teasing between sisters. I never saw the seriousness hidden beneath those words, because Charlie had always been playful, and I had no reason to question her intentions. If anything, I was grateful that the two people I loved most got along so well. Watching them joke together made me feel even more certain that I was marrying into the future I had always dreamed about. Nearly 2 years after our first date, Jordan asked me to take a weekend trip to the small coastal town where we had shared our very first vacation together. I thought we were simply getting away from work for a few days. Instead, as the sun began setting over the water, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Before he even opened it, tears filled my eyes because I already knew what was about to happen. He looked at me with the same gentle smile that had made me fall in love with him, and said he couldn't imagine spending another day of his life without me by his side. When he asked me to marry him, saying yes felt like the easiest decision I had ever made. I didn't hesitate for even a second. I threw my arms around him, and we both cried and laughed at the same time. It was one of those moments people dream about as children and hope they'll experience at least once in their lifetime. I truly believed I was living the beginning of my happily ever after. The weeks that followed were filled with excitement. We toured wedding venues, tasted cakes, met photographers, argued playfully over invitation designs, and imagined what our future home would look like. Jordan wanted a backyard where our future children could play, while I dreamed about hosting Thanksgiving dinners with both families gathered around one enormous table. We talked about everything from baby names to retirement, never realizing how quickly those dreams could disappear. Every decision we made felt like another step toward the life we had planned together. Friends teased us because we couldn't stop talking about the wedding, and even complete strangers smiled whenever they saw how happy we were. Looking back, I realize happiness can sometimes make you overlook things that would have seemed obvious under different circumstances. I was so focused on building a future that I failed to notice someone else was quietly trying to claim it for herself. Charlie became even more involved after the engagement. At first, I thought she was simply being the supportive sister every bride hopes to have. She volunteered to help me choose decorations, insisted on coming to meetings with vendors, and constantly offered to run errands whenever Jordan or I became too busy. She seemed genuinely invested in making our wedding perfect. She called Jordan often, explaining she needed his opinion on surprise plans she was organizing for me. Sometimes, she'd stop by his office to drop off documents or ask questions about the ceremony. Whenever I thanked her for helping, she smiled and told me she wanted my wedding day to be unforgettable. I believed every word she said, because why wouldn't I? She was my sister. She had stood beside me my entire life. The thought that she could be building something entirely different behind my back never crossed my mind. If anything, I felt blessed to have someone willing to do so much for me during such a stressful time. Still, every now and then, there were moments I couldn't quite explain. I would walk into a room and notice Charlie suddenly ending a conversation with Jordan. She always had a reason ready before I could even ask a question. Jordan never seemed uncomfortable, and neither of them gave me any reason to doubt them. Once, I found Charlie wearing one of Jordan's hoodies while helping organize decorations at our apartment. She laughed and explained she had spilled coffee on her blouse, and Jordan had offered her something clean to wear. It sounded reasonable, and Jordan confirmed the same story without hesitation. Another time, I noticed Charlie seemed unusually interested in knowing exactly where Jordan would be every day, often asking questions I assumed were connected to wedding planning. I ignored every tiny concern because I trusted them both completely. Trust has a strange way of silencing the quiet voice inside you that whispers, something isn't quite right. Then came the afternoon that would quietly change everything. Charlie called Jordan while I was at work and asked if he could stop by her apartment after work because she needed help with something she didn't want to discuss over the phone. She told me later that evening that Jordan had been kind enough to help her, and when I asked him how everything went, he simply smiled and said it had taken longer than he expected, but everything was fine. I accepted that answer without another thought. I had no idea that simple visit would become the beginning of the nightmare that would eventually tear apart two families, destroy my engagement, and leave scars that none of us would ever completely escape. At the time, it was just another ordinary day. Looking back now, I realize it was the last ordinary day any of us would ever have. Looking back now, I realize the man I fell in love with had been carrying a burden so heavy that it was slowly breaking him apart, and I was too busy planning our future to see it. After the evening he spent helping Charlie at her apartment, something about Jordan changed. It wasn't obvious at first. He still called me every morning, still kissed me goodbye before work, and still asked about wedding plans, but the light in his eyes had faded. The smile that once came so naturally now looked forced, as though he was trying to convince both of us that everything was fine. There were moments when I'd catch him staring at me with tears gathering in his eyes before he quickly looked away. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, he would smile weakly and tell me he was simply exhausted from work. I wanted to believe him because trusting Jordan had always been the easiest thing in the world. I told myself everyone goes through stressful seasons. I had no idea he was living every day, trapped between unbearable guilt and a truth he didn't know how to explain. As the days passed, Jordan became quieter than I had ever known him to be. He started canceling dinner plans, saying he needed time to think. Sometimes I'd call him late at night and hear nothing but silence before he apologized for not knowing what to say. More than once he asked if we could meet because there was something important he needed to tell me. But every time we sat across from each other, he lost his nerve. He would reach for my hand, open his mouth as though he was about to confess everything, then stop. Instead, he apologized for being distant and promised we'd get through whatever was troubling him together. I remember telling him that no secret could ever make me stop loving him, because I believed honesty was stronger than fear. Those words seemed to break his heart even more. I couldn't understand why the man who had always been so confident suddenly looked like someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. If only I had known how desperately he wanted to tell me everything before it was too late. 2 weeks later, Jordan asked me to meet him after work. His voice sounded different on the phone. There was a determination I hadn't heard in weeks. He told me he couldn't keep something from me any longer, and that I deserved to know the truth before we took another step toward our wedding. I smiled to myself after hanging up, convinced he was probably about to confess something far less serious than my imagination had created. Maybe he had lost money on an investment or was planning some elaborate surprise for our honeymoon. I even laughed during the drive, thinking about how worried he had been over something that couldn't possibly change the way I felt about him. I never made it to that meeting. Less than 15 minutes after leaving work, another driver lost control of a truck at an intersection. Everything happened so quickly that I barely had time to react. The sound of twisting metal was followed by complete darkness. The conversation that could have changed everything never happened because fate intervened before Jordan had the chance to speak. The next part of my story wasn't something I witnessed with my own eyes. It was pieced together later from medical records, conversations with doctors, and painful confessions from people who wish they had made different choices. I was told that emergency responders fought to keep me alive before rushing me into surgery. My injuries were so severe that the doctors couldn't promise my parents I would survive the night. They prepared my family for the possibility that they might have to say goodbye. Hours turned into days, and days slowly became weeks. I remained unconscious, unaware that life outside my hospital room was continuing without me. Jordan refused to leave the hospital for more than a few hours at a time. Nurses later told me he slept in waiting rooms, skipped meals, and asked for updates every time a doctor walked past. He held my hand when visitors had gone home and whispered that he was sorry over and over again, though no one understood what he meant. Everyone believed he was grieving the possibility of losing the woman he loved. No one realized he was also carrying a confession he feared I might never hear. While Jordan spent nearly every waking moment hoping I would open my eyes, Charlie quietly began rewriting everyone's understanding of what had happened. She first went to our parents, tearfully telling them she was pregnant. She claimed she had tried to keep it a secret because she never wanted to hurt me, but now she could no longer hide the truth. My parents were stunned. Before they had time to process the news, Charlie told them Jordan was the father. She painted herself as frightened and ashamed, insisting that what had happened between them had been a terrible mistake. Soon afterward, she sat down with Jordan's parents and repeated the same story. They were equally shocked, but they believed a child should never suffer because of the mistakes of adults. By the time Jordan learned that both families knew about Charlie's pregnancy, the situation had already slipped beyond his control. Everyone had reached the same conclusion before hearing his side of the story. Jordan denied nothing because he genuinely didn't know what had happened that night. He remembered going to Charlie's apartment to help her, remembered accepting a drink she offered him, and remembered waking up confused with almost no memory of the hours in between. The uncertainty haunted him. He questioned himself constantly, wondering if he had somehow made an unforgivable mistake that he simply couldn't remember. Charlie never hesitated when anyone asked what had happened. She answered every question with complete confidence, making Jordan's confusion look like guilt. My parents pleaded with him to take responsibility. His own parents reminded him that if Charlie was carrying his child, the baby deserved a father who would stand by them. Jordan insisted he needed time because he still intended to tell me everything the moment I recovered. He refused to discuss marriage with Charlie, saying he loved only me and wanted me to hear the truth from him first. But with every day that I remained unconscious, the pressure grew heavier. The families became more insistent. Charlie's story became more convincing. And Jordan found himself trapped between the woman he loved, lying silently in a hospital bed, and a child he believed might be his. He had no idea that the most difficult decision of his life was still waiting for him. There are moments in life when people convince themselves they are making the least painful choice, only to discover years later that they simply chose a different kind of pain. That was the position Jordan found himself in while I lay unconscious, completely unaware that the future we had planned together was slipping further away with every passing day. The doctors continued giving cautious updates, explaining that while my heart was still beating, there was no way to predict whether I would ever regain consciousness. Some days, they sounded hopeful. Other days, they warned my family to prepare for the possibility that I might never wake up at all. Those words slowly changed the way everyone around me began making decisions. Instead of asking what Sarah would want, they started asking what everyone else should do if Sarah never came home. My absence created a silence that others rushed to fill, and before long, choices were being made that I would have spent the rest of my life trying to understand. Jordan fought those conversations every chance he got. He refused to remove my engagement ring from his finger, refused to pack away our wedding plans, and refused to accept that my story had already come to an end. But grief, fear, and relentless pressure have a way of wearing down even the strongest people. According to Jordan's mother, every family meeting ended the same way. Charlie sat quietly, with tears in her eyes, while both sets of parents debated what the honorable thing to do would be. My parents believed an innocent child deserved stability. Jordan's parents feared what relatives, friends, and their community would say if Jordan abandoned a pregnant woman carrying what everyone believed was his child. They reminded him that reputation takes a lifetime to build and only a moment to destroy. They insisted that regardless of how the pregnancy had happened, a man had responsibilities he could not ignore. Jordan argued until his voice became hoarse. He told them repeatedly that he loved me and no one else. He begged them to wait until I recovered because he wanted to explain everything to me before making any life-changing decision. Every time he said my name, someone gently reminded him that there was no guarantee I would ever hear another word he spoke. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were preparing him for reality. Day after day, the same conversations repeated themselves until hope slowly became overshadowed by obligation. Jordan wasn't choosing between two women anymore. In his mind, he was choosing between the woman he loved and the child he believed might spend a lifetime wondering why its father walked away. Charlie understood exactly how exhausted Jordan had become. She stopped arguing and instead became patient, calm, and seemingly understanding. She never demanded that he marry her immediately. Instead, she quietly reminded everyone that every week she remained unmarried would invite more questions from friends and extended family. She spoke about the baby constantly, describing nursery colors, tiny clothes, and the future she imagined for her child. My parents softened every time they heard her talk. Jordan's parents became even more convinced that delaying the inevitable would only make things worse. Looking back, I often wonder whether Charlie realized she no longer needed to convince Jordan at all. She only needed everyone around him to keep repeating the same message until he finally believed there was no other path left. Sometimes, manipulation isn't loud. Sometimes, it simply allows other people to do the persuading while quietly standing in the background. By then, Jordan had stopped sleeping properly. He looked physically exhausted, emotionally broken, and completely isolated. The man who once faced every challenge with confidence had become someone who questioned every decision before making it. He visited my hospital room every morning, held my hand, whispered apologies I couldn't hear, and then walked into another day filled with people telling him that the future he wanted no longer existed. The morning Jordan finally agreed to marry Charlie wasn't marked by celebration. There was no excitement, no relief, and certainly no happiness. It happened after another long conversation with both families, during which my doctor admitted there had been no meaningful change in my condition for weeks. Jordan stared silently at the floor before quietly saying he would accept responsibility for the baby because he refused to let an innocent child suffer for the choices of adults. Even then, he made one thing painfully clear. He wasn't agreeing because he had fallen in love with Charlie. He wasn't replacing me in his heart. He simply believed that if the baby truly was his, then the child deserved a father who would be present from the very beginning. No one noticed the tears rolling down his face as he said those words, because everyone else was too relieved that a decision had finally been made. My parents embraced him. His parents thanked him for doing what they believed was right. Charlie lowered her head and pretended to cry, but later, when someone showed me photographs taken that day, I noticed something no one else seemed to mention. Beneath her carefully composed expression was the faintest hint of satisfaction, the look of someone who believed she had finally won. The wedding itself was nothing like the one Jordan and I had spent months planning together. There were no joyful dances, no laughter echoing through the reception hall, and no excited conversations about the future. Friends who attended later admitted the atmosphere felt more like a gathering weighed down by obligation than a celebration of love. Jordan stood at the altar, wearing a suit that should have marked the happiest day of his life. Yet every photograph captured the same expression on his face. His smile never reached his eyes because it wasn't really there. He answered every question with quiet respect, but his voice carried none of the excitement people expect from a groom. Guests whispered among themselves, wondering why the ceremony felt so heavy, though few dared ask the question aloud. The decorations were beautiful, the flowers were elegant, and every detail looked perfect from a distance. But no amount of beauty could disguise the emptiness that lingered over the entire day. There was one chair positioned near the front that remained empty throughout the ceremony. A chair originally reserved for me when Jordan and I had chosen the venue months earlier. No one removed it. Perhaps they forgot. Or perhaps, somewhere deep inside, even those celebrating knew that someone was painfully missing. As Jordan placed the wedding band on Charlie's finger, he fulfilled a promise he had never intended to make. Applause filled the room, but it sounded strangely hollow. Family members congratulated the newly married couple while photographers captured smiles that barely lasted long enough for the camera flash. When the reception ended, guests returned home, believing they had witnessed the beginning of a new family. None of them could have imagined that the marriage they had just celebrated had been built on grief, confusion, and unanswered questions rather than love. Jordan returned to the hospital before the night was over, still wearing his wedding suit beneath an overcoat. He walked quietly into my room, sat beside my bed, and looked at me for what felt like hours. He apologized again for failing me, convinced I would never hear his words. Then, just as he stood to leave, something happened that no doctor, no family member, and certainly no one attending that wedding expected. For the first time in weeks, my fingers moved. Moments later, my eyes slowly opened, and the first face I searched for was the man I still believed was waiting to become my husband. The first thing I remember after opening my eyes was the blinding light above me. Everything felt heavy. My body wouldn't respond the way I wanted it to, and every breath seemed to require more strength than I had left. For several moments, I couldn't understand where I was or why my parents were standing beside my bed with tears streaming down their faces. My mother grabbed my hand so tightly that it almost hurt, repeating my name over and over as though she was afraid I might disappear again. My father, a man I had seen cry only once before in my entire life, stood silently in the corner, trying to hide the emotion on his face. Nurses rushed into the room after noticing changes on the monitors, Doctors began asking me simple questions to test my memory, and everyone around me celebrated what they called a miracle. I smiled weakly because I knew I had survived something terrible, but there was only one question that mattered to me. As soon as I found enough strength to speak, I whispered Jordan's name. My parents exchanged a glance so brief that most people would never have noticed it. But even through the medication and exhaustion, I saw it. It lasted only a second, yet something about that silent exchange planted a feeling in my heart that I couldn't explain. I asked again where Jordan was. This time, no one answered immediately. My mother gently brushed the hair away from my face and told me I needed to focus on recovering. My father cleared his throat and looked out the window instead of looking at me. The doctor interrupted to explain that I had a long rehabilitation ahead of me and that stress could slow my recovery. Everyone seemed determined to talk about everything except the one person I wanted to see. I convinced myself Jordan was probably outside speaking with the doctors or calling his parents to tell them I had finally regained consciousness. That explanation made perfect sense to me, and I held on to it because the alternative never crossed my mind. I spent the rest of the day expecting him to walk through the hospital door with flowers in his hands and tears in his eyes. Every time footsteps echoed down the hallway, my heart raced. Every time the door opened, I looked up with hope. Every single time, it was someone else. Nurses came and went. Specialists checked my progress. Friends sent flowers. Relatives visited briefly. But the man who had promised never to leave my side never appeared. And with every passing hour, the silence surrounding his absence became harder to ignore. The following morning, I finally gathered enough strength to ask my mother directly if Jordan knew I was awake. She hesitated just long enough for me to realize she wasn't deciding what to say. She was deciding what not to say. She forced a smile and assured me that everyone knew I was improving, then quickly changed the subject by asking whether I wanted something to eat. My father did the same whenever I mentioned Jordan's name. Even Charlie, who had barely visited during the first day after I woke up, seemed unusually uncomfortable whenever our conversation drifted toward my fiancé. At first, I blamed myself for imagining things. I had just come out of weeks of unconsciousness. My mind was still recovering, and perhaps I was becoming overly sensitive. But there is a feeling that lives deep inside all of us, one that quietly warns us when something isn't right. That feeling refused to leave me alone. The room was filled with smiling faces, yet none of those smiles reached their eyes. It was as though everyone had agreed to protect me from a truth that would eventually find me anyway. Later that afternoon, a young nurse I hadn't met before entered my room carrying medication and a clipboard. She was cheerful, talkative, and completely unaware of the careful silence everyone else had been maintaining around me. As she adjusted the equipment beside my bed, she smiled warmly and said, "Your family has certainly been through a lot these past few weeks. Your sister has barely had time to enjoy being a newlywed." The words were spoken so casually that, for a brief moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood her. I stared at her without blinking, waiting for her to correct herself. Instead, she continued writing notes on the chart, completely unaware that she had just shattered my entire world with a single sentence. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it echoing inside my head. I asked her what she meant, but before she could answer, my mother's voice interrupted from the doorway. She rushed into the room, her face suddenly drained of color, and gently asked the nurse to leave us alone. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since waking up. No one looked at me. No one spoke. I already knew that whatever they had been hiding from me was far worse than I had ever imagined. I turned toward my parents and asked the question they had been avoiding since the moment I opened my eyes. Who did Charlie marry? My voice was barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to shake the entire room. My father slowly lowered his head while my mother began crying before she had even answered. That was when I knew. Long before she finally spoke, I felt the truth settle into my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I needed honesty more than comfort. Through tears, she finally whispered the words that changed my life forever. Jordan married Charlie. The room became completely silent. I heard the words, but my mind refused to accept them. I actually laughed because they sounded so impossible that they had to be some kind of misunderstanding. I told them they must have confused Jordan with someone else. I reminded them that Jordan was my fiancé, that we were planning our wedding, that he loved me. Nobody corrected me. Nobody argued. They simply cried harder. My laughter disappeared as quickly as it had come. For the first time since the accident, I realized surviving had not saved me from losing everything. It had only delayed the moment I would discover just how much had already been taken from me. There are moments when heartbreak arrives so suddenly that your mind refuses to accept what your ears have just heard. That was exactly what happened to me. I sat there staring at my parents, waiting for one of them to smile and tell me it was all some terrible misunderstanding. I wanted someone to laugh and say the nurse had confused Jordan with another man, or that Charlie had married someone with the same first name. Instead, the silence only grew heavier. My mother couldn't stop crying. My father couldn't look me in the eyes, and every second that passed made the truth feel more real. I kept shaking my head, repeating the same words over and over again. No, that's not possible. Jordan would never do that. Charlie would never do that. I wasn't trying to convince them. I was desperately trying to convince myself. My entire future had disappeared while I was lying unconscious, and somehow everyone else had continued living as though it was the only reasonable outcome. I wanted to scream. I wanted answers. Most of all, I wanted someone to tell me why the two people I trusted most had destroyed the life we were supposed to build together. Instead, all I received were tears, apologies, and long periods of silence that somehow hurt even more than the truth itself. Over the next several days, visitors came into my hospital room one after another, but not a single person could give me an explanation that made sense. My parents insisted they had only done what they believed was best under impossible circumstances. Jordan's parents spoke about responsibility, family honor, and an innocent baby who deserved a father. Friends avoided taking sides, saying everyone had suffered in different ways. Every conversation left me feeling more confused than the one before it. It was as though everyone had agreed on the ending without ever questioning how the story had reached that point. The more people spoke, the more I realized they were carefully choosing their words, leaving out details they either didn't know or didn't want to share. Every explanation sounded rehearsed, polished, and incomplete. No one could answer the one question that refused to leave my mind. If Jordan loved me the way everyone always believed he did, how could he marry my sister only weeks after doctors weren't even sure whether I would live or die? Nothing about it resembled the man I had spent years loving. The pieces simply refused to fit together, and that unanswered question settled deep inside my heart, refusing to let me accept the version of events everyone expected me to believe. Charlie finally visited me 3 days after I learned about the wedding. She walked into my room wearing simple clothes instead of the bright colors she usually loved, her wedding ring catching the light every time she nervously twisted it around her finger. The moment our eyes met, she burst into tears. She apologized before I had even spoken a single word. She kept saying she never wanted any of this to happen, that life had forced impossible decisions onto all of us, and that she wished things had turned out differently. Anyone standing outside that room would have believed they were watching a grieving sister consumed by guilt. She reached for my hand several times, but I pulled away every single time. I couldn't bear the thought of her touching me while wearing the ring that should have been mine. She cried harder, telling me she never meant to hurt me, that she hadn't planned any of this, and that she hoped one day I could forgive her. I listened without interrupting, because something about her tears felt strangely empty. Charlie had always been expressive, but this was different. Her words sounded right, yet they never reached her eyes. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. I only knew that the sister sitting beside my bed felt like a complete stranger. The person I dreaded seeing most was Jordan, yet at the same time, he was the one person I needed answers from. When he finally walked into my hospital room, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner than I remembered. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His shoulders were slumped as though he hadn't slept in weeks. And the confident man who had once filled every room with quiet warmth now looked completely defeated. He stopped a few feet away from my bed and couldn't bring himself to move any closer. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us spoke. I searched his face for anger, happiness, relief, regret, anything that would explain why he had married Charlie. Instead, all I found was pain. Real pain. The kind that couldn't be faked. His lips trembled as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He lowered his head before finally whispering the words, "I'm so sorry." That was all. No excuses. No attempt to defend himself. Just 3 words spoken by a man who looked completely broken. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to shout at him, demand an explanation, and tell him he had destroyed my life. But as I looked into his eyes, something stopped me. This wasn't the face of a man celebrating a new marriage. This was the face of someone living inside a nightmare he couldn't escape. The silence between us said more than any argument ever could. Jordan still couldn't look directly at me for more than a few seconds before lowering his eyes to the floor. Every time he tried to speak, his voice failed him. It was almost as though the guilt he carried had become too heavy to put into words. Before leaving the room, he quietly placed something on the bedside table beside me. It was the small notebook we had used while planning our wedding. Every page was filled with our dreams, our guest list, honeymoon ideas, sketches of our future home, and little notes we'd written to each other during meetings with wedding planners. He rested his hand on the notebook for a brief moment before turning toward the door. Just before he walked out, he whispered, "There isn't a single day I don't wish things had been different." Then he left without looking back. I watched the door close behind him, and for the first time since learning about the wedding, I wasn't overwhelmed by anger. I was overwhelmed by confusion. Nothing about Jordan resembled a man who had happily walked away from the woman he loved. His grief felt genuine. His regret felt overwhelming, and his silence felt less like the silence of someone hiding a betrayal and more like the silence of someone trapped by one. Several weeks later, my doctors finally cleared me to leave the hospital. My body had healed enough to return home, but emotionally, I felt more broken than the day I arrived. As my father helped me into the car, I looked back at the hospital entrance, where I had expected Jordan to be waiting the day I woke up. Instead, all I carried with me was a heart filled with questions no one seemed willing to answer. During the drive home, I replayed every conversation over and over again. Charlie's tears, my parents' silence, Jordan's apology, none of it fit together. If Jordan had truly fallen in love with Charlie, why did he look as though marrying her had destroyed him? Why did his apology sound like someone asking forgiveness for something far bigger than simply choosing another woman? The more I thought about it, the less I believed the story everyone had accepted. Deep inside, I felt there was a missing piece, something hidden beneath months of carefully guarded secrets. I didn't know what that secret was, but one thing had become painfully clear. The truth hadn't died the day I was involved in that accident. It was still out there, buried beneath lies, guilt, and silence. And whether my family wanted me to find it or not, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life wondering how I lost the man I loved. I was going to uncover exactly what happened while I was fighting for my life, no matter how painful the answers turned out to be. By the time I returned home, everyone expected me to grieve what I had lost and slowly move on with my life. They believed the story had already been written, that the painful chapter was over, and all that remained was learning how to live with it. But the more I replayed every conversation in my mind, the less I believed the explanation everyone had accepted so easily. Nothing about Jordan's behavior matched the picture they were trying to paint. A man who willingly abandoned the woman he loved doesn't spend weeks sleeping in hospital waiting rooms. He doesn't look at her with tears in his eyes after marrying someone else. He doesn't carry so much guilt that he can barely speak. Something was missing, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that every answer I had been given was carefully arranged to keep me from asking the next question. So instead of trying to forget, I decided to remember. I wrote down every date I could recall before the accident, every phone call, every family dinner, every wedding appointment, every moment Charlie had insisted on helping us. I filled page after page with names, times, and conversations until a pattern slowly began to emerge. The more I looked, the more I realized that the truth wasn't hidden because it had disappeared. It was hidden because everyone had been looking in the wrong direction. I started with the easiest place to find answers: our phone records. Jordan and I had shared almost everything during our engagement, including access to certain account information for wedding planning. As I compared the records with my calendar, one detail immediately stood out. Charlie's calls to Jordan became far more frequent after our engagement. At first, they were short conversations about flowers, venues, and invitations. Then, they became longer. Sometimes she called him several times in a single day, always explaining that she needed his opinion about another surprise she was planning for me. I remembered believing she was simply trying to make my wedding unforgettable. Looking at those records now, I realized she had been creating opportunities to spend more and more time alone with him while making it appear completely innocent. I also noticed something else that made my heart race. There was one evening where dozens of calls and messages suddenly stopped without explanation. It was the same evening Jordan had visited Charlie's apartment to help her with what she described as an urgent personal matter. After that night, everything about him had changed. Until then, it had simply been another date on a calendar. Now, it felt like the beginning of everything that followed. My search led me to people neither my family nor Charlie expected me to speak with. I met the apartment building's concierge, who remembered Jordan arriving that evening looking completely normal and leaving hours later looking pale, disoriented, and unusually quiet. One of Charlie's neighbors remembered hearing raised voices after Jordan had already left, as though Charlie had been arguing with someone over the phone. Another person recalled Charlie appearing strangely cheerful the following morning, despite telling everyone later that she had been overwhelmed with shame. None of those details proved anything by themselves, but together they painted a picture that didn't resemble the version Charlie had spent months repeating. I also found messages Charlie had sent to a close friend during that period. They weren't direct confessions, but they revealed an obsession I had never noticed before. And she admitted to deliberating, inviting Jordan to her apartment, and how she intentionally spiked his drink so her plans could work. She spoke constantly about finally getting the life she believed should have been hers. She convinced herself that fate had been unfair by bringing Jordan into my life instead of hers. Reading those messages made my stomach turn, because they weren't written by a loving sister struggling with guilt. They were written by someone who believed she had spent years living in another person's shadow and was determined to step into the light, no matter who had to be pushed aside. The final piece arrived from a place I never expected. Charlie's closest friend asked to meet me privately after hearing rumors that I had started searching for answers. She looked terrified throughout our conversation, as though carrying a secret she had regretted keeping for months. She admitted Charlie had spent weeks telling her that if Jordan ever believed he had ruined our relationship beyond repair, he would never risk hurting me again by telling me what had happened. Charlie had carefully built a story around misunderstandings, selective truths, and deliberate omissions until Jordan himself became convinced that he had destroyed our future. Every time he questioned what he remembered, Charlie answered with complete confidence, leaving no room for doubt. She controlled the narrative so completely that even his uncertainty became evidence against him. Listening to that confession felt like someone finally opening a window inside a room that had been dark for months. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I understood why Jordan had looked so broken every time our eyes met. He hadn't looked like a man protecting a happy new marriage. He had looked like someone convinced he had betrayed the woman he loved and no longer deserved her forgiveness. I asked Jordan to meet me at the small lakeside park where he had proposed to me so many months earlier. The moment he arrived, I saw the same sadness that had never left his face since the accident. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I told him I knew the story we had all been forced to believe wasn't the complete truth. His shoulders began trembling before I had even finished the sentence. It was as though the weight he had been carrying had finally become too heavy to hold any longer. For the first time since everything fell apart, he told me every detail he could remember. He spoke about the confusion that followed his visit to Charlie's apartment, the overwhelming guilt that consumed him afterward, the fear that he had somehow destroyed both our lives, and the relentless pressure from both families once Charlie announced she was expecting a baby. He admitted that every day he intended to tell me everything, but after my accident, he believed he had lost that chance forever. As he spoke, tears streamed down both our faces. We weren't crying because the past could be changed. We were crying because we finally understood how completely our lives had been manipulated by someone we had both trusted. I reached across the table and took his hand for the first time since the accident. Forgiving him didn't erase my heartbreak or restore the future we had planned together. It simply meant I finally understood that he had been trapped inside Charlie's deception as surely as I had. The tragedy wasn't that we had stopped loving each other. The tragedy was that someone else's choices had stolen the life we should have shared, leaving us both to grieve a future neither of us had willingly abandoned. The strange thing about finally learning the truth is that it doesn't erase the pain you carried before you learned it. If anything, it gives that pain a new shape. I left the park that afternoon with tears still drying on my face, knowing Jordan had never stopped loving me, yet also knowing that love alone couldn't undo everything that had happened. Charlie was still his wife. There was still a baby on the way, a child who had done nothing wrong and deserved to enter the world without carrying the weight of the adult's mistakes. Jordan called me several times over the following weeks, not because he expected us to pick up where we had left off, but because for the first time in months, we could finally speak honestly. We talked about the future we had once planned, the wedding that would never happen, and the dreams we had both quietly buried. There were moments when we laughed through our tears, remembering vacations, family dinners, and silly arguments over paint colors for a house we would never buy together. Then reality would return, reminding us that some losses cannot be repaired simply because the truth has finally been revealed. The hardest part wasn't realizing we still loved each other. The hardest part was accepting that love could no longer solve the problems standing between us. I chose not to tell anyone what I had discovered immediately. Instead, I watched. Sometimes, silence reveals more than confrontation ever could. Charlie continued presenting herself as the devoted wife and excited mother-to-be, but the happiness she tried so hard to display seemed to fade a little more each week. Jordan fulfilled every responsibility expected of him. He attended doctor's appointments, helped prepare the nursery, and made sure every financial need was met. From the outside, they appeared to be building a happy family. Inside their home, however, something was missing that no amount of effort could create. Respect can be earned. Trust can sometimes be rebuilt. But genuine love cannot be forced into existence. Every conversation between them sounded polite rather than affectionate. Every smile looked practiced instead of natural. Friends who visited later admitted they often felt uncomfortable without understanding why. The house was beautiful. The baby gifts filled every room, and the photographs on the walls looked perfect. Yet there was a quiet emptiness that no decoration could hide. Charlie had finally obtained everything she believed she wanted, but she couldn't understand why victory felt so lonely. As the months passed, I began rebuilding my own life one small step at a time. Recovery wasn't limited to learning how to walk without pain or regaining my physical strength. The more difficult recovery happened inside my heart. I returned to work part-time, reconnected with friends I had pushed away during my engagement, and slowly rediscovered the parts of myself that had disappeared beneath grief. Some mornings I woke up believing I had finally moved on, only to find myself crying after hearing a song Jordan and I once loved. Other days I surprised myself by smiling without guilt. Healing was never a straight path. It came in quiet moments that reminded me life was still moving forward, even when I wished it would stand still. My grandmother once told me that forgiveness is something you give yourself long before you give it to someone else. For a long time, I didn't understand what she meant. Now, I finally did. Forgiving Jordan had freed me from anger. Learning to forgive myself for trusting the wrong person was an entirely different journey. Not long after Charlie gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, I saw Jordan again at a family gathering held for the child's naming celebration. It was the first time we had stood in the same room since our conversation at the park. He looked exhausted, though not because of sleepless nights with a newborn. It was the exhaustion of a man trying to honor responsibilities he had accepted while quietly mourning the life he had lost. He held his son with incredible tenderness, and in that moment I understood something that finally brought me peace. Whatever had happened between the adults, this innocent little boy deserved a father who loved him completely. Jordan looked at me from across the room, and although neither of us spoke, we shared a silent understanding. Our story had changed forever. We could spend the rest of our lives wishing for a different ending, or we could accept that some chapters close so others can begin. As I watched Charlie observing Jordan from across the room, I noticed something I had never seen before. She wasn't looking at him with triumph anymore. She was looking at him with fear. Deep inside, she had begun to realize a painful truth. Winning someone's presence is not the same as winning their heart, and no deception, no matter how carefully planned, can force genuine love to grow where it never truly existed. Time has a way of exposing truths that people spend years trying to hide. For a while, it looked as though Charlie had finally built the life she had always wanted. She had the beautiful home, the devoted father for her son, the admiration of relatives who believed everything had worked out exactly as it should have. To anyone looking from the outside, they appeared to be a happy family, but appearances can only hide reality for so long. Every time I saw Jordan with Charlie, I noticed the same thing. He was always kind, always respectful, and always present for their son. Yet there was a distance between him and Charlie that could never be disguised. He fulfilled every promise he had made as a father, but he never looked at Charlie the way he had once looked at me. There was no warmth in his smile, no excitement in his voice, and no quiet moments of affection that naturally exist between two people deeply in love. Their conversations revolved around schedules, bills, doctor appointments, and their son's needs. They lived under the same roof, but they no longer seemed to share the same life. Charlie had spent years believing that if she could only get Jordan to marry her, everything else would eventually fall into place. Instead, every day reminded her that love cannot be demanded, negotiated, or won through deception. It must be given freely, and that was the one gift Jordan could never offer her. As months turned into years, the cracks in their marriage became impossible to ignore. Family gatherings grew uncomfortable because Jordan and Charlie rarely spoke unless it involved their son. They stopped arriving together, often making excuses about work schedules or other responsibilities. Even my parents, who had once defended every decision that led to their marriage, quietly admitted something wasn't right. My mother confessed one afternoon that she hadn't heard Jordan laugh in a very long time. My father, who rarely shared his emotions, told me he regretted rushing to conclusions while I was in the hospital. Those words didn't erase the past, but they meant more to me than he probably realized. For the first time, my parents acknowledged that trying to force a solution had only created a different tragedy. Charlie noticed the change too. She became increasingly frustrated that no matter how much effort she made, Jordan remained emotionally distant. She planned vacations, organized anniversary dinners, and surprised him with thoughtful gifts, hoping something would rekindle feelings that had never truly existed. Every attempt ended the same way. Jordan thanked her politely, appreciated her kindness, and continued treating her with respect, but never with the love she desperately wanted. The harder she chased his heart, the more she realized it had never belonged to her in the first place. One evening, quite unexpectedly, Charlie came to my house alone. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the confident woman who had once believed she had everything under control. She looked exhausted. The confidence that had defined her for so many years had been replaced by quiet regret. She asked if we could talk, and after a long moment of hesitation, I invited her inside. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, she began crying harder than I had ever seen her cry. Between tears, she admitted that every single day of her marriage reminded her of what she had done. She confessed that waking up beside a man who never truly loved her was far more painful than she had ever imagined. She said she had convinced herself that if enough time passed, Jordan would eventually forget me and fall in love with her. Instead, the opposite happened. Every act of kindness from Jordan only reminded her that he was honoring his responsibilities, not sharing his heart. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and quietly said, "I thought if I could become you, I'd finally be happy." I never realized happiness can't be stolen. Hearing those words didn't fill me with satisfaction. They filled me with sadness because I finally understood that jealousy had destroyed far more than one relationship. It had destroyed my sister from the inside long before it destroyed the rest of us. Not long afterward, Jordan and Charlie made the difficult decision to separate. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no shouting in front of family members, and no public accusations. They simply reached a point where both of them understood they could no longer pretend they were living the marriage everyone else imagined. Jordan promised he would always remain an active father, and he kept that promise faithfully. He never missed birthdays, school events, or doctor's appointments. Their son grew up surrounded by love from both parents, even though they were no longer husband and wife. Watching Jordan devote himself completely to his child reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. His character had never changed. His circumstances had. That realization finally allowed me to let go of the last pieces of resentment I had been carrying. I stopped wondering what my life would have looked like if the accident had never happened, because I knew no answer could change the life I was living now. The past had shaped me, but it no longer controlled me. Years later, people occasionally asked whether I regretted forgiving Jordan or whether I hated Charlie for what she had done. My answer always surprised them. Hatred would have chained me to the worst chapter of my life forever. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting the betrayal or pretending it never happened. It meant refusing to let someone else's choices define the rest of my future. Charlie lost the marriage she sacrificed everything to obtain. Jordan lost the woman he had planned to spend his life with. My parents carried the weight of decisions they wished they could undo. We all paid a price, though not in the ways any of us expected. As for me, I eventually discovered that peace isn't found by getting back everything you've lost. Sometimes, peace arrives the moment you stop allowing yesterday to steal another day from your tomorrow. Looking back now, I don't remember my story as one about a wedding that never happened. I remember it as the moment I learned one of life's hardest lessons. Someone may be able to steal a ring, a ceremony, or even the future you imagined for yourself, but they can never steal the love, integrity, and strength that define who you are. Those things remain yours forever, and in the end, they become the foundation on which a new life is built. Walking away from everything I had lost was the hardest decision I had ever made, but staying trapped in that pain would have been even harder. For months, I woke up every morning expecting the sadness to disappear, only to realize healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, in moments so ordinary that you almost miss them. It was the first morning I laughed without feeling guilty. The first time I walked past a bridal shop without breaking down. The first evening I realized I had gone an entire day without replaying the past in my mind. Those moments weren't dramatic, but together they became the beginning of a brand new chapter. Instead of asking why all of this had happened to me, I started asking a different question. What kind of life did I want to build from here? That single question changed everything. I stopped measuring my future by what I had lost and started measuring it by what was still possible. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was finally living. One opportunity led to another, and I accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that helped families rebuild their lives after unexpected tragedies. Every day I met people carrying stories that reminded me pain wears many different faces. Some had lost loved ones. Others had lost businesses, homes, or lifelong dreams. Yet so many of them refused to let those losses define who they would become. Listening to their stories slowly helped me rewrite my own. My experiences gave me a level of compassion I never would have understood before. Instead of seeing myself as someone whose life had been destroyed, I began seeing myself as someone who had survived unimaginable heartbreak and still found the strength to keep moving forward. My confidence returned little by little. I enrolled in leadership courses, earned promotions I never thought I was capable of, and eventually found myself mentoring younger women who were struggling to believe in themselves. It amazed me how the very pain I once wished had never happened became the reason I could encourage someone else not to give up. Outside of work, I rediscovered parts of myself that had quietly disappeared while I was planning a wedding and dreaming about a future that never came. I started traveling again, something I had always loved but kept postponing because life always seemed too busy. I visited places I had only seen in photographs, watched sunrises over unfamiliar coastlines, hiked mountain trails that reminded me how small my worries looked from the top, and learned to enjoy my own company without feeling lonely. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and found joy in simple moments that I once overlooked. Slowly, I realized I had spent years believing happiness was something waiting for me at the end of a wedding aisle. I couldn't have been more mistaken. Happiness wasn't a destination another person could give me. It was something I had to build inside myself, one decision at a time. The more I embraced that truth, the lighter my heart became. People occasionally asked whether I had ever found love again. I always smiled before answering because they assumed that was the only ending worth celebrating. The truth is, I first found something even more important. I found the woman who had always been strong but had forgotten her own worth while trying to hold on to a future that was no longer hers. I learned that my value was never determined by whether someone chose me, stayed with me, or broke my heart. My value had always been there. I simply needed to see it again. Whether love found me again someday was no longer the question that defined my life. I had already discovered fulfillment through meaningful work, genuine friendships, personal growth, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive your darkest seasons and still choose hope. That realization became the greatest victory I had ever experienced. As for Charlie and Jordan, life continued teaching them lessons that no one else could teach. Jordan remained a devoted father, never allowing his son to carry the burden of mistakes made by adults. Charlie faced the consequences of choices she could never undo, and gradually came to understand that lasting happiness can never be built on someone else's heartbreak. My parents spent years rebuilding the trust they had lost, and although our family was never the same, we slowly learned to move forward with greater honesty than we had before. None of us escaped the consequences of the past, but each of us had the opportunity to decide what kind of future we would create from it. That choice, I learned, belongs to every one of us. If my story has taught me anything, it's this: healing doesn't begin the moment you get back what you lost. Sometimes you never get it back. Healing begins the moment you stop believing your best days disappeared with your greatest heartbreak. Someone else's betrayal may change the direction of your life, but it does not have the power to determine your destination unless you hand that power over. I chose not to. I chose to rebuild, to grow, to forgive where I could, to learn from what I couldn't change, and to create a life that no longer depended on the people who once hurt me. Looking back now, I no longer see myself as the woman whose sister married her fiancé while she was in the hospital. I see myself as the woman who survived unimaginable betrayal, rebuilt her life from the ground up, and discovered that the strongest foundation anyone can ever have is the one they build within themselves. And to everyone watching, thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in my position? Could you have forgiven, or would you have walked away forever? If you've ever had to rebuild your life after heartbreak, know that you're stronger than you realize. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep believing in new beginnings, and remember that sometimes the life waiting for you after heartbreak becomes even more meaningful than the one you thought you had lost.